So when I was a kid, I used to remember my dreams a lot. I used to have some really bad nightmares from time to time. But the older that I became, call it adult stress, pressure, whatever, I reached a point where I would dream, but I stopped remembering what I dreamt about. So I've always been fascinated by other people's dreams and the details. And I was lucky enough earlier this year to hear the details of someone's dream. And me being the way that I am, I decided to have some fun with that and write a short story based upon that and those details. So this is an unpublished story. It's probably been read by maybe 4 or 5 people. It's called Fruits of Labor. Nuala, this is for you. Happy Halloween. Every once in a while, he would remember his Christian name, as his mother used to call it, but those times weren't often. For over 20 years, he had simply been called Stone by the other people, like him who lived on the streets. There was no reason to use anything else. He crawled from the small hutch of cardboard he had slept in the night before, and blinked at the overhead sky. It was overcast and gray, and Stone wondered if the sun would burn it off as the day wore on. The cardboard shelter wasn't where he normally stayed, only a makeshift spot behind an alley dumpster to spend the night and get some sleep as he scoured the lines of the city. The house dwellers going to and from, they didn't see the order of the lines. They only saw direction, and it saddened Stone. Realizing the order in that chaos so long ago is what had set him free. All of those people consuming and taking. Take. That's all they did. He used to think that way, that pushing papers here and there and attending meetings deemed important and valuable actually meant something. But they didn't. They contributed nothing. Locusts. All of them locusts, consuming and eating and moving on to something else when the fields of their attention were empty. To live is to give. Stone had seen that phrase on a church sign years ago, and it had lodged in his mind like a piece of gravel in the tread of a work boot. The thought made him glance down at his bare feet. To describe them as dirty would be a weak and unworthy attempt. No. Stone's feet were caked and covered to a burnt brown color and texture like the bark of an ancient pine tree. He pulled the hem of his tan canvas pants lower toward his ankles, and the scent of what was beneath wafted toward him. The flesh of his calves itched, and he moved, carefully getting to his knees, and stood to stretch. His thick tumbleweed beard itched, and Stone ignored it at first, and then ran a hand over his face and down over the coarse hair and thick clusters nested within. It had started a month ago after he had spent a few days sleeping at Haddon Park in the middle of the city. It had been beautiful there, surrounded by the tall, peeling sycamore trees framing the long, curving pond. He had stared at the reflection of the moon flickering in the water and the black shadows of the ducks as they swam. The wood ticks had come for him in the night as he slept, slowly making their way to a new home in the wild thicket of his beard hair. Stone had let them be. After all, they were only doing what they were meant to do. And now they grouped among the graying strands of his beard and fed, shiny and swollen like overripe green grapes. He ran a hand down over them again, the sensation against his palm like touching a collection of polished marbles. There was a soft popping sound, faint and muffled, as one of the ticks burst and thin pus squirted over the salt and pepper hair of his beard like morning dew. In the distance, a church bell rang. Stone considered walking toward the sound to watch the people gather, but he decided against it. He'd seen enough house-dweller sheep in his life, and besides, he had his own flock to attend to. It was time. He twisted, stretched his back again, and lifted his backpack from the cobbled-together cardboard shelter. Stone slung the strap over his shoulder and headed toward the tunnels, his real home, and the home of his flock, It took close to an hour to reach the tunnel from here, but Stone didn't mind. After all this time, the sidewalks and alleyways were familiar friends. He took his own path, through torn chain-link fences and abandoned yards, overgrown with weeds and concrete blocks scattered like broken teeth. He reached the entrance to the subway tunnel and set his backpack to the pavement. It was time. Stone sat down, withdrew a harmonica from the front pocket of his stained denim jacket, and began to play. A slow, mournful harmony that grew in tempo and pitch. He drew breath from his tired lungs, exhaled into the hobo harp, making it sing. The ticks in his beard wriggled and grew antsy from the noise. And as Stone stared into the shadows of the tunnel, he began to see them appear and walk into the light. One by one they came closer and sat, cross-legged and silent, gathering at the song he played. 3 at first, then 4 more, another 5. The people he had grown to love and care for during his years on the streets all gathered around him and sat in a circle. Their expressions varied from mild amusement and smiling eyes to the too familiar vacant stare of someone wondering how they came to arrive at their destination in life of living homeless. Stone played a few moments longer, and then tucked his harmonica back into the iron pocket of his jacket. His smile was safely hidden behind his beard, but it was there as he scanned the faces of the people surrounding him. He gave a nod. To live is to give. Stone stood among them and studied their expectant, hopeful faces. How it had come to be, Stone couldn't remember, but gradually, over time, they had all started to view him as provider, protector, guider, shepherd. He stepped closer to Rags, the young brunette woman who had come to live among them several years ago. Stone remembered her arrival well, bruised and beaten like a dog bound for a shelter, as his flock had welcomed her in with open arms. They had cared for her as Stone had taught them, nursed her body and healed her mind, and here she was before him, fire in her eyes once again. He looked skyward and uttered a silent request. Stone raised his arms out to his sides and began to weep at the silence from his unheard prayers. Tears fell along his cheeks, creating trails through the grime, lighter than the surrounding skin. Stone nodded slightly and sadly at the expected silence, and his attention turned toward the darkness of the tunnel and what lay beyond. He repeated his plea for help, and soft whispers began at the back of his mind. Murmurs layered on top of one another, making the words indecipherable. A choir discussing a legion of forbidden secrets. Inside the hairy froth of his beard, the gluttonous crowd of ticks began to release their parasitic grip. One by one they began to writhe and move and march. They crawled north until they dragged themselves over the skin of his weathered lips, their spindly legs as soft as the tickle of a baby's eyelashes. An assembly line of engorged ticks continued along Stone's face and neck, making their way down his arms, until they began to reach his calloused, filthy hands. The people gathered around Stone's feet began to sway. He turned to Rags and offered her a plump tick, filled so tightly the flesh was smooth as a green tomato, and the young woman took it into her mouth and chewed. Her eyes closed as she savored the delicacy. One by one, Stone fed the group of homeless birds the parasites of his love. One by one, they took his offerings, biting into the 2 full ticks. Stone watched the filled sacks burst inside their mouths, like well-made confections packed with strawberry jam. Gradually, the creeping sensations along his hands slowed, and then stopped. And Stone felt the people licking at his fingertips, their mouths hungry still, yearning like newborn calves for their mother's teat. Stone smiled at his flock and bent to the cuffs of his pants. His attention was on the tattered end of his left leg first, and he took time and care to peel it up from his ankle. cautiously moving the fabric away from the odd, bulging form around his leg. The musk rolling from Stone's legs was earthy and dank. He grabbed the pants cuff and pulled, tearing the worn cloth along the stitched seam. Pale green curls of vine sprung free, and Stone released a deep sigh at the release of pressure. He pulled harder and the cloth tore higher, up to his thigh. Stone turned to his other leg, repeated the process, and stood, his pants in tatters of cloth. Stalks embedded into the flesh of his calf muscles, bulged beneath Stone's mud-colored shins. Pale green, sun-hungry vines twisted into thin branches and groups of broad leaves. Stone saw the flock's expression change, their hungry faces filled with awe. A skinny post of a man everyone called Nails reached out timidly towards Stone and plucked a tomato from the vine. The group's focus turned to watch Nails place the tomato between his lips and tenderly bite into the fruit. It popped, and a small mixture of juice and seeds slopped over the man's lower lip. Nails closed his eyes and inhaled through his nose, almost sensually, as he chewed. Nails opened his eyes again, and the rest of them began to reach for Stone's legs. Each time a ripe tomato was pulled from the plants, Stone trembled as shivers rolled through his body. One by one they took of him, eating tomato after tomato, until his vines were empty, barren of fruit and blossom, and yet the congregation at his feet were hungry still. Stone was empty, a void, a dry field. The moist sound of them chewing the fruit, grown of his flesh and blood, continued until they were silent again. Stone looked down at their faces, still full of hope and light and hunger. Still hunger. Stone smiled and nodded as at abandoned children, the lost souls looking to him for guidance, for salvation. He pushed the sleeve on his left arm up toward his elbow, exposing his wrist and forearm. Protector, shepherd, provider. Stone did the only thing he could do. There had never been a choice. He brought his wrist toward the matted tangle of his beard and put his mouth against the gritty, salty skin before biting down. Blood spilled onto his lips, and Stone clenched his teeth harder and wrenched his head to the side. A flap of skin tore away, like the first bite of a fresh apple. He turned and offered his bleeding wrist to his flock, and they clamored over one another to drink. He stood, giving his life, until he couldn't. The muscles in his thighs felt watery and as weak as a newborn kitten's. Stone fell to his knees on the warm pavement. His head swam, and distantly he felt someone bite into the soft flesh of his right wrist. He spread his arms wide. They clawed at him, clutching fistfuls of his grungy clothes. The vines along Stone's legs, now stripped of fruit, broke and snapped under the attention of their clenching hands. The green plant smell mixed with the hot penny scent of his blood. He let himself fall backward into the fold and watched the sky overhead darken as the shape of their silhouettes descended upon him. Stone closed his eyes and smiled and let his sheep feed until darkness arrived.